Morning, Lucy. It's lovely to speak to you, and good morning to everybody that might listen to this afterwards from Glasgow University. So, look, I'm a first-time candidate for the Scottish Parliament. I have been involved in Scottish politics for a number of years, but this is the first time I'm putting myself up towards the electoral vote. For me, it's all about I want a vision of Scotland and what it's going to look like in the future. I think there is an opportunity, especially with the Scottish Lib Dems, to have something different to say about how Scotland might look in the next decade or 20 years. I'm a federalist, and one of the big problems that we have in Scotland right now is this constant talk about the constitution and how it's going to look. Is Scotland going to be independent? Is it going to be part of the United Kingdom? And I think actually there's a third way and a third conversation that we should be having, and that's about federalism. Now, some people might say, well, what is federalism? So, federalism is a new constitutional settlement that means actually, kind of similar to what the USA and Germany and other countries around the world have, is about having a constitutional United Kingdom, but with more powers for all the nations that make up that United Kingdom. So I think there's an opportunity for me to put a different voice forward for Glasgow that's not just one between independence and unionism. I think there is a third way, and that's one of the reasons why I decided to stand here. But also, look, it's absolutely clear to me that there's a number of issues in Glasgow that have to be tackled. We've got severe housing crisis, we've got a homelessness problem, we've got environmental damage that's being done in Glasgow. And in fact, we need somebody that's going to be a strong voice for tackling those. I think if you look in Glasgow city centre, we have to. There was a report that came out that said there's only like 11 people living homeless in Scotland. That's an absolute travesty to make that statement. There's people queuing up in the snow on a nightly basis that should not be living on the streets in a rich country like Scotland and the United Kingdom. And we have to do something urgently about that. And that's about building more homes and making sure people can get the housing that they need. But secondly, look, for me, one of the biggest reasons I decided to stand is the environment. I think it's when you look at Glasgow as a whole, I'll just put it one particular street, which is Hope Street within the Kelvin constituency where I'm standing. That's the most polluted street in the whole of Scotland. It's actually fallen below European standard for emissions for years now, and the only reason last year it was below those minimum standards is because of the pandemic and people weren't travelling. We can't return after this to that environmentally damaging and pollution state of Glasgow that's damaging our health, our potential children's health, and elderly people as well. And it puts a strain on the NHS, more people with heart problems, more people with stroke problems, more people with lung disease, especially during a pandemic like this that actually affects your lungs. We need to make sure that we stop that when it comes to the next term of Parliament. So that's the things I'm going to be standing on. Is tackle the housing crisis, tackle the environment, make sure there's an opportunity to put something forward on the Constitution that I think can benefit everybody as opposed to just one of the sides of that argument.
Graduates are understandably concerned about job prospects post-COVID. So we're wondering, how are the Scottish Lib Dems planning on addressing this issue?
So it's absolutely true that there's going to be a huge economic impact for the economy across the whole of the United Kingdom and especially Scotland as well for the next maybe 5, even longer years as a result of this. We've seen a yo-yo effect in GDP, which is obviously going to affect, once we come out of furlough, how many people are in employment and also what's the aftershocks of that for the next 4 to 5 years. But if you look at some other countries across the globe, I'll pick on, for instance, Canada. So Canada obviously do have our sister party, the Liberal Party, and Justin Trudeau, and they've announced actually that they're going to be putting strategic investment into sort of build back better schemes. And what that means is obviously big shovel-ready projects that are going to bring more people into employment, especially in things like engineering graduates, about how you build, big projects that are going to actually benefit the economy. So I think there's that's key, is how do we invest? And I think there's opportunities to look at things like our rail infrastructure in Scotland. I think there's a real need to do serious improvements there. There's the road infrastructure, but I think what we actually need to be looking at is stuff like investing in hydrogen technology, renewable technology, and getting people into employment via those schemes. But look, students have been really hardly hit by this pandemic, and I think it would be remiss of me not to point out what's happened to a lot of students when they did come back to university and been stuck inside. And in some ways, I absolutely feel for students who felt they were being blamed in a lot of cases for when cases started to rise in a particular area like Glasgow, and it was like, oh, because they've come back from wherever they've been. it wasn't students' choice to do that. They were asked to come back to university. They were following the rules that were set for them, and that needs to be recognised. So, look, I think we also have to. One of the big things that I'm interested in looking at as well is a universal basic income. And I think as well, for people who are coming out of school and out of it further education, it's a basis to help them then grow. So it's a base income that says, okay, once you come out, it gives you that opportunity to look for a particular job without sort of sitting going, God, I need to find a job quick, or else I'm not going to have any steady income. And I think there's a really good opportunity to talk about Glasgow as a large city as being a trial basis for Scotland on how a UBI might work. And we've seen, actually, I mentioned Canada before. One of my friends over in Canada, Nathaniel Erskine Smith, is an MP in the Liberal caucus out there. And Canada's actually about to start launching some UBI trials as well to see how that might help benefit people, both coming out of university, but also a lot of lower income people, to go on and actually allow them to not have to go and take there's a have to very quickly look for employment and actually find the correct employment for them, for their skills, for their job requirements, to then be able to benefit society as a whole.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think adequate support has been given to students during the pandemic, and how would you ensure students receive more support going forward?
No, well, I don't think there's been adequate support for students at this present time. I think we've seen a lot of students have really struggled, not only from the perspective of how they've been treated in coming back to university, but I also think there's a serious lack of funding in mental health services as well for people and students. Look, I think it's prudent right now. One of the and apologies, I forgot his name right off the top of my head, but I was speaking to one of the professors in mental health studies, especially in suicide rates in young men at Glasgow University. And I think we seriously need to start looking at, when you're in a situation like this, how do we put more funding towards supporting students in a difficult situation who would be cut off from their family and friend environment to get through this situation through, through therapy and other means to help them be supported. So I think there is absolutely a case to be made there. Obviously, when we come out of this pandemic, it might not be in this particular situation, but we still need to recognize that there are people who do have struggles with mental health, and we don't want to just drop that after the pandemic's ended. But I also think there's a real case to be made about how we support students overall. And actually, I've recently launched a platform called All Our Ideas / Glasgow Recovery. And what that is I believe really in civil engagement, and how we get more people involved in telling me what they want to be done in the area, and not me telling you what I think should be done in the area. And what I'd really love to hear is from students as well, because look, students form this part of the population, especially in areas like Glasgow Kelvin, that's probably not overly recognised, and because it is a fluctuating population. You know, they come in, sometimes they move out, and they might not even be registered to vote in Glasgow. They might be registered to vote at home, so they don't always get recognised in that regard. But with this platform, like a civil engagement platform, I want to hear from students about how they think I could help support them, and how perhaps the Scottish Government could support them better, because I don't have the basis of all the best ideas. Um, Students are immensely good for Glasgow's economy. They support a number of our, especially retail, and also our nightlife economy is greatly supported by the student population. So yeah, I'd love to hear that, and if you'd be open to it, I'd love to give the link to that to hear from more students about how I might support and what else we can be doing to help support students at Glasgow.
What actions do you plan on taking to tackle the climate crisis in Scotland?
Pollution and how we talk about the environmental impact, you need to focus on the now, what's happening to people now. Obviously, there is a climate emergency that is coming down the line quite rapidly, but there's effects that are happening right at this moment in time. I think what we need to do is actually flip the switch on how we talk about the climate emergency, because there are some people out there who, for reasons unbeknownst to me, are not convinced of this yet, and we need everyone to move on this quickly. And if you focus on the health impact that it's having in places like Glasgow because of a result of pollution, I think you'd get people to move on that a lot faster. The Liberal Democrats are committing to, actually, once we get into the next term of Parliament, having a real review of how we spend on public transport infrastructure and active transport, which is people walking, cycling, wheeling, whatever form they take to their jobs. And we're also committed to introducing the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods, which is that you will have all the needs on your doorstep within walking distance or cycling distance. So your GP's surgery, shops to be able to shop for your weekly groceries, your school will be on your doorstep and within walking distance, and we need to also make an effort to make sure that more kids are walking and cycling, etc., to school, because there has been a move away from that. I mean, when I was a young boy, I used to walk to school, but I know there's a lot of people now that have changed, and because I understand the reasons, parents want to make sure their kids get to school safely. But I think if we come up with new ideas about things like walking buses to get kids to school, you can tackle that fear around safety as well. So there's the investment, first of all, in the public transport, but I think, look, Scotland should be leading the world in renewable energy, especially in things like hydrogen production. So we have natural resources in terms of our water supply that would absolutely make us one of the world's leaders, and we could probably be exporting that as well. I've seen some really interesting concepts as well from companies like Orbital Marine that I've had some work with, and what they're doing in terms of wave energy production. And they're looking at investing heavily in places like Orkney and the Shetlands. So we need to be looking, but I think there's also a gap to be plugged there between how we very quickly move off fossil fuels and we maybe move to renewables. But I do think there's an opportunity there to talk about, well, would nuclear energy come into that conversation as well to rapidly help us get off fossil fuels, go over to a more green energy producing solution, and then as renewables progress, we have that opportunity to move there. But you probably saw the disaster that was the Bifab yard in Fife as well. We need to make sure that our manufacturers are actually benefiting out of us moving towards a renewable future. We shouldn't be, look, if you're going to do green procurement, and this is something I talk to a lot of companies about, you shouldn't be getting a wind turbine built in Canada and then shipping it from Canada to Scotland. We should be able to build that here and make sure it's as environmentally friendly as possible to then build it here, produce it here, keep it here, and get the energy results here, as opposed to getting it built somewhere, shipping it, the CO2 emissions from there, and then you're already in a deficit that you have to, pull back. So that's just a glimpse into some of the things, but I want to be more radical. I think there's a lot of things that we should be doing.
I was going to ask about the NHS, because obviously over the past few years there's been a lot of scrutiny into the funding of the NHS, and particularly given the coronavirus pandemic, it's come under immense pressure. So I was wondering, how do the Scottish Lib Dems plan on supporting the NHS further?
Oh, look, first of all, with the NHS, you've got to make sure the people who are the frontline workers that have dealt with this pandemic are paid properly. So I would absolutely support, as do the Lib Dems, in a review of the pay scales for frontline NHS staff and making sure that they are paid accordingly for the work that they did during this pandemic. I think that's opportunity number one. But look, we need to make sure there's a number of issues that have happened in Glasgow recently, and we've seen, the opening of new hospitals where children have died as a result of toxic water, and there's a lot of residents who said to me in Glasgow that they're concerned about their safety when they go into hospitals in Scotland, and that's tragic. I mean, we should not have an NHS system where people don't feel safe when they go in to seek medical care. So first of all, I think there needs to be a real open and transparent review into how some of these health boards have operated, and make sure that the failings that have happened don't happen again. And that's priority number one. And then I think secondly, we've got to make sure that the NHS is funded properly, because for a number of years it hasn't been. But look, there's some things that I'd really love to tackle if I manage to get into the Scottish Parliament, and that's, every year, and you look at, we always have a winter bed problem. There's every year we get into the winter and we don't have enough beds for the number of patients that come in. Now, if you look at a country like Germany, who also has a free at the point of use health program, they never have that problem, because they actually tackle the problem head on and making sure that they have the beds available, and they don't just wait for it to become a cyclical problem. And in fact, in speaking with some people who work within the health system over in Germany, they're quite surprised that we seem to have this recurring again and again and again every year. And I also think there's and look, this is always something that people find contentious when you say this. I think there's reforms that the NHS could go through in Scotland, and I don't mean reforms as in how it operates, and I don't mean anything in regards to it not being free at the point of use. I think there's reforms that could be made into how the NHS actually operates and how we fund it. There's a number of things that I've seen in years before when I've been consulting with the NHS across the UK, especially in things like how they procure products that are frankly slightly behind the times, and we could probably quickly and save a lot of money by challenging those and getting them up to speed. So I think you need to fund the NHS properly. You also need to review the NHS to make sure that the funding, etc., is going to the right places and it's making sure it's changing the correct things. And you need to make sure that frontline staff who've dealt with this pandemic are paid properly and that they have job security as well. And one of my best friends is a frontline nurse, and she's spoken to me quite openly about the fact that the way she's paid and the way she's treated, it would probably be more prudent for her to maybe look at a job in the private sector. We can't have that happen. We need nurses and we need people on frontline staff, especially the tragedy of Brexit means that we're not going to have access to a lot of people who come to this country that provide that work. So how are we going to get British people to fill that gap? And now I still think we should be making sure that we have an option for people to come to this country to provide care work. But there are going to be gaps that we need to address. So I think it's funding. It all comes down to funding.
Might be aware of a recent internal report done by the University of Glasgow that revealed, just on the topic of discrimination, huge racial problems. And last year there was an internal review into Police Scotland that also showed racial bias. So I was wondering how you plan on helping Scotland become a safe place for people of colour.
I have friends who work in Police Scotland, and I think there's this interesting comparison, especially that came out when we had obviously the BLM protests in London, and obviously, as you said, the Sarah Everard vigil in London as well, with how the Met tackle these things and how Police Scotland. But look, I think we should always be striving towards more racial equality and making sure that people feel safe. Now, I think Scotland is extremely benefited in the fact that we are an open place that's open to people of all cultures coming to live, to work, and be part. I think it's there was a really interesting piece I read about refugees coming to Glasgow, and the refugees that stayed in the hotel in Glasgow, and people calling them refugees, which is basically, once you come here, you're a Glaswegian. We don't care where you're from. You get invited and you get to be part of this city. But again, look, the best thing I can do as a white male is to support what people think is the best way to tackle these racial inequalities. And I think it's down to people like me to listen and be there and hear and get people's opinions on how we tackle these things and how I can best support that. And I don't want to sit here and say, I think we should do X, because I've never experienced it. I've just never experienced it. And I think that's the best thing I can do, is to be a voice there, to be open, listen, take people's points of views across, and then take them to places like the Scottish Parliament and other institutions in Glasgow and be a supportive voice in how we change things.
That would bring us to the end of the interview. And unless you want to add anything else, then I think that probably is us finished with the questions that I had. So I don't know if you would like to add anything else.
Look, the only thing I would say is I really want to hear from everyone in Glasgow. And I know you probably hear politicians that come around at this point in time and say, oh, please talk to me. And it's, but I really do believe that I am not the beholder of all great ideas. And Glasgow is a creative place. It's an imaginative place. It's a place that has done wonderful things over the years. And I think there's a number of people in places like Glasgow University, Strathclyde University, Cali, I don't want to miss anybody off. And if I have, I do apologise, that have great ideas that could greatly benefit Glasgow, Scotland, the United Kingdom. But we need to be putting things in place that allow people to contribute, and that's why I'm trying to do these things on civic engagement. And I want to hear from people, and I want people to give me their ideas and then see how I can help support taking those forward. So yeah, please do get in touch. Please let me know what you think and how I can maybe help.
Well, I'd say thank you very much for speaking to me today. It's been really great to talk to you.
Me too.
And I do really wish you the best with the upcoming election in the next few weeks.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And thanks everyone for listening.